My name is Hannah. I'm 32 years old and I work as a middle school science teacher at a public school in a small town in Ohio. I've been doing this for 7 years. I know what people think when I say that. Oh, that's sweet. Good for you. And then they move on to talk to someone else. Last Thanksgiving, my older brother held his annual dinner at his house. It's always a big affair. His wife decorates the whole place. There's a caterer. There are people I barely recognize from his company. My brother is a senior partner at a consulting firm in Chicago. He makes more money in a month than I make in a year. I'm not saying that with bitterness, it's just true. I wore a dark green dress that I'd bought on sale 2 years ago. I drove 2 hours to be there. I brought a homemade pecan pie because I didn't know what else to bring, and I didn't want to show up empty-handed. I should have known, honestly. I should have known from the moment I walked in and saw the look on my sister-in-law's face. Not unfriendly, just the particular kind of polite that tells you exactly where you stand. But I stayed. I poured myself a glass of wine, found a quiet corner near the fireplace, and tried to enjoy the evening. And for a while, it was fine. The food was good. Someone's kid showed me a magic trick. An older couple near the window asked me about my drive down, and we talked for a few minutes about highway traffic. Then my brother stood up to make a toast. He does this every year. He likes to go around the table and introduce everyone. Say something about what each person does. It's meant to be warm. It usually is. But this year, something was different. He went around the table slowly. He introduced his business partner, great man, closed 3 major deals this year. He introduced his father-in-law, retired surgeon, legend in his field. He introduced 2 colleagues from his firm, and he told a funny story about each of them that made people laugh. Then he got to me. He smiled. He said, "And this is my little sister, Hannah." He paused just long enough to make it obvious. She's a public school teacher, you know, middle schoolers. He laughed a little, and a few people at the table smiled in that polite, slightly uncomfortable way. Someone said, "Oh, that's wonderful," in the tone people use when they don't really think something is wonderful. I kept my face still. I took a small sip of wine. I had been in that position before, many times, and I had learned that reacting only made it worse. My brother moved on to the next person. The moment passed. Or I thought it did. But then something happened that I wasn't expecting. At the far end of the table, a man I didn't recognize had gone very quiet. He was somewhere in his late 60s, well-dressed, silver at his temples. He had been laughing along with everyone else a few moments earlier. But now, he was looking at me with the kind of expression that people have when they're trying to place a face. I noticed it, but didn't think much of it. I turned back to my wine. Before I tell you the rest of this story, I want you to understand something about what it actually means to teach middle school in a public school in a district where most of the kids come from families that are struggling. I want you to understand it not because I want sympathy, but because what happened at the end of that dinner only makes sense if you understand what the job actually is. Middle school science means you are dealing with 12 and 13-year-olds who are right in the center of the most turbulent years of their lives. They're not little kids anymore, but they're not teenagers yet either. They're in between everything. Their emotions are enormous, and their ability to regulate those emotions is almost non-existent. They fight with each other constantly. They cry in your classroom. Sometimes they come to school having not eaten since the day before. Sometimes they come in wearing the same clothes 3 days in a row and hoping nobody notices. And you teach them about cells and ecosystems and the water cycle, yes. But really what you're doing, underneath all of it, is showing up. Every single day. Making your classroom feel like somewhere safe when everywhere else in their lives might not be. I had a student named Marcus. No, I can't use his real name. Let me call him something else. I had a student I'll call Eli. He came into my class at the start of 7th grade and he wouldn't look at anyone. Wouldn't speak in class. Sat in the back corner and drew in the margins of his notebook and seemed to be counting the minutes until he could leave. I didn't push him. I just made sure he knew I saw him. I'd put a small sticky note on his desk sometimes. Good question yesterday, even if he hadn't asked one out loud. Or just, glad you're here today. Small things. The kind of things that cost nothing and mean everything to a kid who doesn't think anyone notices him. It took 4 months before he looked me in the eye. It took 6 months before he raised his hand in class for the first time. At the end of the year, his mother came to pick up his final report card. She stood in my doorway and cried. She said she didn't know what I'd done, but her son had started talking again at home. He had started laughing again. She said she'd been terrified about him, that there had been a period where she genuinely didn't know if he was going to be okay. I told her what I'd done was just my job. She shook her head and said no. She said it was much more than that. I thought about Eli a lot that Thanksgiving dinner. I thought about him when my brother made his little joke. I thought about all the Alyss I'd taught over 7 years, all the kids who had come through that classroom at their most fragile, and I thought about what it means to call that work not important enough to say out loud without a small, apologetic laugh. I stayed quiet. I kept my face neutral. I did not make a scene. But the man at the end of the table was still watching me. About 15 minutes after my brother's toast, the conversation at the table shifted. People were on their second glasses of wine. The mood had loosened up, and someone started talking about education, about schools and standardized testing, and whether kids today were being prepared for the real world. It was the kind of dinner party conversation that sounds substantive, but usually isn't. My brother's father-in-law said something about how teacher salaries were probably fine considering the summers off. A few people nodded. I looked down at my plate. Then the man at the end of the table spoke. He hadn't said much the whole evening, so when he did, people sort of naturally quieted to hear him. He had the kind of voice that does that, calm, unhurried, the voice of someone who's used to being listened to. He said, "I have a question." He looked around the table. "Does anyone here know what percentage of a child's waking hours is spent in school?" A few people guessed. Someone said 30%. Someone else said 40. The man nodded slowly. He said, from age 5 to 18, a child spends roughly a third of their waking life in a classroom. He paused, which means teachers don't just teach, they raise children. Alongside the parents. Sometimes instead of the parents. The table was a little quieter now. My brother smiled in the way he does when he's not sure where a conversation is going but doesn't want to seem caught off guard. He said, "Sure, absolutely, teachers are great, we all appreciate teachers." The man didn't smile back. He looked down the table at me. He said, "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name earlier." I said, "Hannah." He nodded slowly. "Hannah." He repeated it like he was checking something in his memory. He asked, "Did you ever teach in the Columbus area? Before you were in your current school?" I felt something shift slightly in my chest. I said, "Yes." I started my career at Riverside Middle School. I was there for my first 3 years. The man went completely still for a moment. He said, "Riverside," in a quiet voice, almost to himself. My brother glanced between us. He said, "Do you two know each other?" The man didn't answer right away. He set down his fork. He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "I think we might." The table had gone quite still. Even the people at the other end who had been in their own conversation had noticed something and turned toward us. The man said, "About 8 years ago." He stopped, seeming to think carefully about whether to continue. Then he did. He said, "My granddaughter was a student at Riverside." He paused again. She was going through an extremely difficult time. We'd all been watching her, worrying about her. She was 12. She had stopped eating. She was withdrawing from everything and everyone. Her parents were working with doctors, with therapists, but nothing seemed to be reaching her. He looked at me steadily. And then one day she came home from school and told her mother that her science teacher had noticed her journal in class. Not to embarrass her, she said, just to say that the things she wrote were worth reading, that someone had actually read what she'd written and thought it mattered. My throat went very tight. He said, that teacher started staying after class with her once a week. Let her talk, or not talk, whatever she needed. Showed her a book about a scientist who had grown up in poverty and still changed the way we understand the world. Wrote her a note at the end of the year that my granddaughter still keeps in her desk drawer. He stopped. I remembered. I remembered her. A quiet girl who drew tiny detailed sketches in the margins of her lab reports, who never raised her hand but always stayed a few minutes after the bell. I remembered the book I'd given her. It was about Barbara McClintock, the geneticist, the one who spent decades being dismissed by the scientific establishment and turned out to be right about everything. I remembered because I had thought about her over the years and wondered how she turned out. I said very quietly, "How is she?" The man's expression shifted. Something warm moved across his face. He said, "She is in her second year of medical school." Someone at the table let out a small sound. Someone else touched their glass but didn't pick it up. He looked around the table for a moment and then he looked at my brother. He said, "Your sister didn't just teach my granddaughter science." He said it slowly, without any heat, just as a statement of fact. She was one of the reasons that child is still here. My brother had stopped smiling. No one laughed. No one made a small, polite joke. The room was as quiet as I've ever heard a room full of people get. The man looked back at me. He said, "I've wanted to thank someone for 8 years and didn't know who to thank." He said, "I think now I know." I didn't know what to say. I never do in moments like that. I said the same thing I always say. I said, "I was just doing my job." He shook his head. He said, "No. You saw a child that everyone else in her life was seeing through doctors' eyes and therapists' eyes and parents' eyes, and you saw her as a person who had something to say that was worth hearing. That's not a job description. That's a gift." My brother said nothing for a long moment. Then he said my name. "Hannah." Just that. I looked at him. His face was doing something complicated. I know my brother's face very well, even after all the years and all the distance that's grown up between us. I could see that he was working something out. Not apologizing, not yet, but working something out. His wife reached across and touched his hand. The dinner continued. The man, whose name I later learned was Dr. Bernard Kessler, retired professor of economics at Ohio State, whose son had married into the family on my sister-in-law's side, he came and found me near the end of the evening when people were gathering their coats. He shook my hand. He said, "Thank you." He said it simply, like a man who'd been carrying something for 8 years and had just found somewhere to put it down. I drove home 2 hours through dark highways with the pecan pie container empty in my back seat. And I thought about Eli. And I thought about the quiet girl who drew in the margins of her lab reports. And I thought about all the kids in between. The ones who might not remember my name in 20 years, but who might remember that once, in a classroom in Ohio, someone saw them. I thought about my brother's face when Dr. Kessler spoke. I don't know what he said to his wife later that night. I don't know if it changed anything between us. Things like that don't usually resolve cleanly. Real life doesn't have a clean ending where the person who was wrong comes forward and says the exact right thing. But I know this. For one evening, in a room full of people who measure success in deals closed and titles held and salaries earned, the truth came out anyway. Not because I demanded it. Not because I fought for it. Just because a man had been waiting 8 years to say thank you, and he finally got the chance. I'm a public school teacher. I make less than most people at that dinner table. I work in a building with a leaking gymnasium roof and textbooks that are 12 years out of date. I buy supplies with my own money every September. I eat lunch in 22 minutes standing next to a microwave. And I would do it again tomorrow, and the day after that. Because there will always be another quiet kid in the back corner who needs someone to see them. That is my job. There is no just in front of it. I've thought a lot about that evening since it happened. Not obsessively, but the way you keep returning to something that shifted something inside you. Quietly, without fanfare, the way most real things do. What I keep coming back to is this. My brother didn't mean to be cruel. I actually believe that. He's not a cruel person. He's someone who spent 20 years in a world that measures human worth in a very particular way, and after a while that measuring becomes automatic, like breathing. You stop noticing you're doing it. You just introduce your sister with that half-apologetic pause before the word teacher and you don't even hear it yourself. But the pause is there, and the people around the table hear it, and the sister hears it. What happened with Dr. Kessler wasn't luck. I don't think it was coincidence either. Not in any mystical sense. It was simply the long reach of ordinary effort. 7 years of showing up. 7 years of staying after class and writing notes and choosing the right book for the right kid at the right moment. That work doesn't disappear. It moves forward through time in ways you can't track or predict. It becomes a granddaughter who is now in medical school. It becomes a quiet boy who starts laughing at home again. It becomes a thank you that travels 8 years to find you at a dinner table in Ohio. That's the thing about doing something with your whole self. Day after day, even when no one is watching, and no one is applauding, and the gymnasium roof is still leaking, and the textbooks are still 12 years out of date. The work accumulates, quietly, without your permission, almost. And I think that's what integrity actually looks like in practice. Not the dramatic moment, not the speech, not the confrontation. Just the daily decision to do the thing properly, even when doing it properly costs you something. Time, energy, money from your own pocket. The small dignity of being introduced at your brother's dinner without an apologetic laugh. That evening, I didn't fight for my reputation. I didn't argue. I didn't list my accomplishments or defend my profession or make anyone feel guilty. I just sat there with my face still and let the room be what it was going to be. And then a man I had never met told the truth, because the truth existed to be told. I had made it exist, one student at a time, over 7 years. That's the only reason it was there to be told at all. I think about Hannah, the version of me that walked into that house carrying a pecan pie and wearing a sail dress and half expecting to be overlooked. She didn't know what was coming. She never does. But she had done the work, and the work was there waiting for her. You don't always get that moment. Most of the time you don't. Most of the time you drive home alone and nobody stands up and says anything and the room doesn't go quiet and nothing changes. That's the reality of it. But you do the work anyway. Because the kids are there, whether or not the moment comes. Because Eli is in the back corner right now, in some classroom somewhere, drawing in the margins and waiting to see if anyone notices. Because that is enough reason. It has always been enough reason. There is no just in front of the work you do with your whole heart. There never was.